welcome everybody to the launch of NICCY's report, Neither Seen Nor Heard, a child's rights review of the use of restraint and seclusion in educational settings. As you know, NICCY's role is to safeguard and promote the rights of children and young people in Northern Ireland, having due regard to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and domestic rights protections. The UN Committee, as many of you will know, has called for the abolition of restraint used for disciplinary purposes, banning the use of techniques which inflict pain on children, and to only use restraint as a last resort to prevent harm to the child or others. It has also called for the abolition of isolation rooms. The purpose of this work by NICCY has been to highlight the impact of the use of restraint and seclusion on children and young people and their families, and identify gaps or indeed failings in guidance and practice. In carrying out the work which informs this report, we engaged with and involved stakeholders in education, including principals and school leaders, statutory agencies including in health, teaching unions, and particularly parents and carers of children who've experienced the use of restraint and/or seclusion, from whom you will hear throughout this event today. I wish to thank them and also all those in our advisory forum who contributed to the work and report overall. It is our intention that the report and recommendations inform that of the Department of Education and their advice to the Education Minister in the new year. The Commissioner will be highlighting the findings in the report and set out her calls across the range of areas which should be addressed to effect the necessary change in practice, including a mandatory policy and guidance to support teachers, parents and schools, and more importantly, to protect children and their rights. We're very pleased that the Permanent Secretary, Dr. Mark Brown, will be shortly joining us to say a few words welcoming the report. In our programme today, it includes a poem written by Caoimhe Redden about her daughter's experiences of multiple uses of restraint and seclusion. Deirdre Shakespeare, parent and campaigner of Harry's Law from the International Coalition Against Restraint and Seclusion, will deliver a presentation on her experiences and views. Chris Little, MLA, the Chair of the Education Committee, will be joining us to give the committee's perspective on restrictive practices in educational settings as well. This will be followed by a parent's perspective from Emma McAfee, whose son experienced multiple uses of restraint and seclusion in school. Finally, we have a panel discussion who will address the findings of the report, evidence of best practice and the recommendations, after which Kula will then make her closing remarks. We now have Dr. Mark Brown, Permanent Secretary of the Department of Education.
Thank you very much, Mairead. I very much welcome the launch of Neither Seen Nor Heard today, and I pay tribute to NICCY and all of those who were involved in the report. The experiences of the children and young people and the impact on them, their families and their friends that are set out in the report and that we will hear more about this afternoon makes very difficult reading and listening. But I can assure you that the Department of Education is listening very closely to all that you say and takes the issues raised in the report very seriously. And the department was happy to support this engagement with parents and young people that was led by NICCY. The department is also undertaking a review of restrictive practices in educational settings in partnership with a range of stakeholders, including NICCY and others who are here today. And my colleague, Ricky Irwin, who is the Director of Inclusion and Wellbeing in the department, is taking part in today's panel and will provide you with an update on this work. We will fully consider the report and use it to inform the department's review and the department's advice to the Minister. So I just want to finish by thanking you for providing me with the opportunity to hear it firsthand from everyone participating in today's event. I'm very happy to lend my support to the report and to assure you all of the full commitment of the department in progressing this important issue. So I wish you all very well with the rest of the afternoon, and I look forward to hearing from all the various contributors. Thank you very much.
Thank Thank you very much, Mark. Now we're going to listen to an audio clip of a brave young boy who recounts his experience of seclusion in mainstream settings. This young boy wanted to help change the use of restrictive practices in schools to make sure no other child is made to feel the way he felt. This clip, as with other contributions today, comes with a caveat or a warning that some viewers might find the content upsetting.
This is my story. I want to share so one day I can help others to never go through what I did. I struggled with work, and the teacher pulled me in front of the class, in front of the whole class, and shouted, "You need to stop fidgeting with your pen and improve my grades." I can't help myself. I have ADHD. I do this when I feel nervous. I had a panic attack in the boys' toilets. I called my mum, crying and bugging, and then I got told off by another teacher for calling my mum. But I was scared and needed her. I know COVID is real, but I can't wear a mask. My autism gives me sensory issues. A teacher made me stand against the wall, pointed at my chest. I felt so scared and ashamed. Why was I being picked on? By a teacher for being different. I struggled at break and lunch because of the amount of people and noise. When school found out I stopped eating, I dropped to 3.5 stone. And their answer was put me in a room on my own at break and lunch. I felt trapped and alone. Why did they not care? I don't like to be different. No. But I am. But I just wanted help. I started to self-harm to cope. The teacher saw one day and just said, "Don't do that again." Could they not see I was scared? They never told my mum, my parents. And I did not either. I tried to kill myself, not once, but twice. It's scary, but I almost succeeded. I just could not see a way out anymore. I thought there was no hope. I felt alone and scared. My mum pulled me out when the school scared refused to help my mum. Refused to help me. My mum got me help, and she even paid £650 to get me statement in school. I only done 3 months of first year. My mum had to fight for a year. I have a full-time 1-to-1 and get a taxi from and to school. I feel safe and listened to. They do so much for me, not for me. I like school again. I wish my mum did not have to fight, but I'm glad she did, because I would not be here writing this letter to you. We should not get punished for being different. We should get the help that we need. Don't judge us. Just give us the help we need it. Because you don't know what it does to kids like us. We deserve to feel safe and happy like everyone else. We should not feel scared by the ones who say they will protect and teach us. I will always fight for kids like me, and I promise that. Goodbye.
Now I would like to introduce the Northern Ireland Children's Commissioner, Cuala Suma, to give an overview of the review findings and recommendations. Cuala.
Thanks, Mairead. And I too would like to add my welcome to all of you today, and again to thank particularly all the parents and the young people, as you've just heard, who told us their stories. So the need for this review came from parents of children who had experienced restraint and seclusion and who felt that they had no avenue by which to seek redress for what had happened to their children. So what is it we're talking about today? There is no statutory definition for restraint and seclusion in educational settings here in Northern Ireland, and this report is intended to add a bit of clarity to that. But just very quickly to go through some definitions. So the umbrella definition of restrictive practices or restrictive interventions are those that intentionally limit or compel a child's freedom of movement or function. Moving on to restraint, in the report we'll be discussing two, mechanical and physical. Mechanical restraint, which is the use of a device, equipment or other tools for compelling, controlling or subduing the bodily movements of the child. And physical restraint is the direct use of physical contact by one or more persons for the purpose of compelling, controlling, preventing or subduing the bodily movements of the child. And finally, seclusion. Seclusion is the placing and keeping of a child alone in a room or other space from which they cannot leave because the exits are locked or otherwise obstructed. Also, there may be an inference, instruction or threat to the secluded child not to leave for fear of the consequences of doing so. There is no requirement on schools and educational settings in Northern Ireland to record and or report on the use of the above restrictive practices. So we do not know the frequency or the impact of these practices on our teachers, on our parents or on our children. Through our legal and policy work, NICCY has gathered information regarding restraint and seclusion being used, particularly on children with additional and special educational needs, to address their distressed behaviour. Furthermore, NICCY has identified issues in respect to seclusion, including in the form of in-school or informal suspension for breaches of uniform rules, hence the decision to undertake this work. I do accept that this review has been a long time coming, and there's a range of reasons why that is. We were determined that the work must complement and not duplicate that of others, particularly the Northern Ireland Public Service Ombudsman and DE. You've already heard from Mark about that. Also, we were also determined that we had the time and the resources needed to do it properly. And I believe that neither Seen nor Heard does just that. It lays out a clear roadmap as to what needs to happen to ensure that our education system is rights compliant. So moving on to the aims of the review. The review sets out to firstly gather the experiences of children and young people through their parents and carers and on the use of restraint and seclusion. Secondly, to highlight shortcomings in regional policy, monitoring, reporting, recording, decision-making and training on the use of restraint and seclusion. Thirdly, it sets out to identify good practice and produce a range of recommendations directed at key government departments and agencies for improving policy guidance and legislation. And finally, it sets out to identify guidance on the use of deprivation of liberty within an educational setting. So how did we go about it? And again, you've heard a little bit from Mairead about that, but I'll go through it again. We reviewed the international human rights instruments, of which there are many. We also reviewed a range of policies and legislations as well as good practice. We drew heavily on No Safe Place, which was published by the Children and Young People's Commissioner in Scotland. We undertook quantitative work and issued an open survey to all schools through their principals in order to gain a baseline of understanding of the use of such practices and to understand the views of school leaders on the current procedures and practices, including current policy, training, recording, reporting procedures and their recommendations for the future. A total of 234 valid responses were received with a 61% completion rate, and all education settings were represented, although as you would expect, there was a higher proportion of a response rate from special schools. We also undertook qualitative research, And again, as you've heard, we worked with DE to ascertain the views, experience and suggested ways forward of parents and carers through focus groups and individual interviews. Neither seen nor heard is heavily influenced by the experience of those parents and carers, as I would expect the work currently being undertaken by E to be also. We also work with a range of key partners and stakeholders who were very generous with their time and knowledge. We undertook interviews with professionals within health and educational settings in relation to their roles and experience of restrictive practices, and again, their recommendations regarding its use. Those of you who read and have seen other reviews from NICCY will know that that all those reviews include large sections on data analysis. But without regional reporting, monitoring, or on the use of restrictive practices in educational settings, there's no way of knowing exactly how prevalent and widespread the use of these practices are. So unfortunately, that section in the review is one short paragraph. Finally, when it comes to methodology, we were kept right by our advisory group who didn't let us get away with anything, no matter how hard we tried. And again, we're very, very grateful to them for that. So moving on to content. Of course, all this work was placed within a rights framework. All statutory schools, all statutory agencies, schools included, have a duty to uphold the rights of the children in their care, including in the administration of any restrictive practice. Such instruments include, but are not limited to, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the European Convention on Human Rights, and the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane and Degrading Treatment or Punishment. I will only briefly touch on the UNCRC. The United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child, through its periodic reporting to the UK state government, has repeatedly outlined steps that should be taken in order to prevent the use of restrictive practices on children's infringing on children's rights. In 2016, again as you've heard from Mairead, the committee stated its concern about the lack of a comprehensive review of the use of restraint in institutional settings in Northern Ireland, and the use of restraint and seclusion on children with psychosocial disabilities, including children with autism in schools. It went on to recommend across a range of sections that the state should abolish all methods of restraint against children for disciplinary purposes in all institutional settings, residential and non-residential, and ban the use of any technique designed to inflict pain on a child. Ensure that restraint is used against children exclusively to prevent harm to the child or others, and only as a last resort. Systematically and regularly collect and publish data on the use of restraint and other restrictive interventions on children in order to monitor the appropriateness of discipline and behaviour management for children in all settings, including education as well as a range of other settings. Ensure, and this is an important one, that corporal punishment is explicitly prohibited in all schools and educational settings. And finally, abolish the use of isolation rooms. The other international treaty bodies also made similar recommendations to the UK government. As you would expect from your Commissioner for Children and Young People, NICCY has consistently reiterated these recommendations over recent years, particularly in our statement on children's rights in Northern Ireland, the second of which was published last year and called for government to act as a matter of urgency. We called on government to act as a matter of urgency. I got confused with all the cameras I was looking at there for a minute, so I'm going back. So our statement on children's rights made three calls. It called for banning the use of restraint and seclusion for disciplinary purpose and the use of any technique designed to inflict pain on children. Ensure that restraint and seclusion are only used as a measure of last resort to prevent harm to the child and others. Make reporting of the use of restraint and seclusion mandatory across all settings. So it is fair to say that we definitely didn't go into this review with an open mind. We went in with a very clear way forward and position. But I do have to say I was prepared to alter my position should the evidence point us in a different direction. For those of you who don't want to know what the recommendations say, spoiler alert, it didn't. Those recommendations remain valid. I have for some time been lost for words that guidance, training, reporting, recording and communication with parents and carers is not clearly laid out in a mandatory framework. I have really genuinely struggled to understand, with the emergence of so many examples of violations of the rights of children, why in the last 2 decades the situation has not been remedied as a matter of urgency. Not only would such remedies keep children and young people safe, but they would also protect staff working education. I had also hoped that common sense would prevail and it would get done, and we wouldn't need to publish a review like this one. So what's the situation here in Northern Ireland? Firstly, the law. All schools and education settings have the statutory responsibility under Articles 3 to 6 of the Education Northern Ireland Order 98 for developing their own good behaviour and discipline policies, including any sanctions to be taken. Section 4.1 explains the powers for staff members from grant-aided schools to restrain pupils. It notes that a member of the staff of a school may use, in relation to any pupil at the school, such force as is reasonable in the circumstances for the purposes of preventing the pupil from doing or continuing to do any of the following. Firstly, committing an offence, as you can see. Secondly, causing personal injury to or damage the property of any person, including the pupil themselves. And finally, engaging in any behaviour that is prejudicial to the maintenance of good order and discipline at the school or among any of its pupils, whether that behaviour occurs during a teaching session or otherwise. This law is clear that it does not authorise anything to be done in relation to a pupil which constitutes the giving of corporal punishment. And here's the rub. I genuinely struggle to see how the use of restrictive practices for the maintenance of good order and discipline can be viewed as anything other than corporal punishment. Following the 98 Act, the Department of Education published Circular 99-9, Guidance on the Use of Reasonable Force to Restrain or Control Pupils. It identifies that the use of reasonable force to restrain pupils should be rare, emphasising that neither the circular nor Section 4 of the Education Order should be used to authorise the use of physical contact that is deliberately intended to cause pain or injury or humiliation. Instead, the circular notes the purpose of Section 4 is to make clear that teachers and authorised staff are also entitled to intervene in other, less extreme situations, which again in itself is problematic, because we should only be talking about extreme situations. The guidance also identifies the importance of keeping written reports on any instance where reasonable force is used to restrain or seclude a pupil, and even states that what the report should include. And it's got quite a detailed list. Then in 2004, a policy framework for the use of reasonable force and restrictive practices was published, containing a working definition of reasonable force, which is the minimum force necessary to prevent a pupil from physically harming himself or herself or others or seriously damaging property, but used in a manner which attempts to preserve the dignity of all concerned. It's a tall ask. Both the circular and the framework are advisory and place no obligation on anyone to support schools to develop safe practices, report to parents, or monitor such practices. Don't worry, we're getting closer to the present day. In October last year, the Minister of Education tasked departmental officials to undertake work aimed at helping to ensure that any seclusion and/or restraint is reasonable, proportionate and justifiable to the circumstances and the appropriate documentation is completed. Further direction was issued by DE in May of this year when it published a circular providing interim guidance to both inform staff that they were undertaking a review, and secondly, it provided educational settings with the department's position in relation to the use of seclusion and reasonable force or restraint, stating the overarching principle is that the best interests of the child should guide all decisions taken by staff in relation to children in their care. So, the situation as it stands today here in Northern Ireland is we have no statutory obligation on schools to record incidents involving restraint or seclusion. Similarly, there is no requirement to inform parents when restraint or seclusion is used on their child. Instead, we have guidance which says that informing parents is always advisable. Lots of people give me advice, I don't always take it. We looked at how the system is working in our schools, and 72% of the schools who responded to the survey had never received guidance on creating a policy on physical interventions. Furthermore, as you can see from the slide, 51% of schools stated that they had a policy on physical interventions that included the use of restraint, whilst only 10% had a similar policy on exclusions. And as you would expect, proportionately, most of these were special schools. So the legislative gaps in the use of reasonable force, the unclear guidance to schools on reporting, recording and monitoring of incidences of restrictive practices, and deficiencies in the current policy regarding the complex support needs of some pupils, as well as collaborations with other professionals such as allied health and social workers, have resulted with the first set of recommendations, again, that you can see on your slide, which are firstly that the Department of Education must create legislation which should include a ban on the use of seclusion in educational settings, a ban on the use of seclusion, a ban on the use of any techniques which inflict pain on children, a definition of restraint and clarity that this should only be used as a last resort, a requirement for mandatory recording of all incidents of restrictive practices by educational settings, and that the Education Authority undertakes an annual review on the use of restrictive practices across all settings, which should include, and you'll see there on the list, the numbers of children who've experienced the intervention, the numbers of time each child has such an experience, the type of de-escalation techniques and restrictive interventions used, and how children and parents were involved and what support and training was required and may be required into the future. Secondly, that the Department of Education must ensure that the legislative framework explicitly limits the use of restraint or force on a child so that it is only permitted to protect that child or others from immediate and serious harm. The Department must review the Education Northern Ireland Order 98, repealing Article 41C, as there is no circumstance where this provision can remain or is relevant for 21st century education here. Third recommendation in this section, is that the Department of Education should issue mandatory guidance on the use of restrictive practices in educational settings, detailing the legislative and policy context and outlining the roles, responsibilities and accountabilities of school staff, external professionals, principals, boards of governors, the education authorities and the department itself. And the guidance obviously should be developed in consultation with schools, professional bodies including trade unions, parents and carers and children themselves. The guidance should provide clarity on legal definitions and should align those definitions with those in the Departments of Health and Justice, should change the use of terminology from challenging behaviours to distressed behaviours, and I'll say more about that later, should ensure the provision of training and should outline the requirement to immediately inform parents and carers of the incidents, following up with a formal report which should include measures to support the child and staff and prevent further such incidences. The fourth recommendation in this section is that the Department of Education must establish regional standards on restrictive practices in schools, including how to minimise their use and eliminate the use of seclusion. Such a policy must be rights-based, child-focused, ensuring that all children are protected, regardless of their background, status, additional needs or disability. Moving on to complaints, but before I do that, I'm going to have some water. Parents have described an unequal power balance in the complaints processes between them and schools, as well as a situation where boards of governors are insufficiently equipped to discharge their governance responsibility in dealing with complaints. Where the rights of the child are not enshrined in legislation, it is really difficult for them to be upheld through a complaints process. This is what happens when you don't incorporate the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child into domestic legislation. Therefore, under the current system, the complaints and redress procedures within schools and beyond are unable to protect the rights and safety of children. This has proved to be stressful and demoralising for parents. Without a robust mandatory framework, complaints processes are next to useless, as has been evidenced throughout the report. So we make the following recommendations. Within the revised guidance document for schools, the Department of Education should outline standards for responding to complaints in line with the complaint standards set out by the Northern Ireland Public Service Ombudsman. The guidance should also provide direction on providing pathways for staff and others to raise concerns. Parents should be informed of independent advocacy and support services, including peer advocacy, to assist with their complaint. There was also some discussion during the writing of the review with regards to whether these processes should evoke child protection procedures. Interestingly, 60% of principals believe that restrictive practices should be within safeguarding procedures. There was no clear feeling amongst parents. There was also a clear feeling amongst parents that there is not enough recognition in formal processes that children can be harmed and are harmed outside of their home as well as sometimes inside it. This and other reports and today's event are full of examples of where harm has been done to children. None of what we are talking about today should be viewed as diluting or ignoring the responsibilities of education settings to keep children safe and to be held accountable if they fail to do so through formal safeguarding and criminal justice processes where necessary. Throughout engagement with parents and carers, it was apparent that they did not want to be seen as unfairly negative or overly critical, especially towards education staff in general. A number of parents and carers complimented individual teachers for their contribution in trying to help, including where their child was having negative experiences in school. Effective, reasonable adjustments that are child-centred were consistently commented on when talking about positive relationships with staff members and schools. The review uncovered the need for a clearer and more consistent understanding of restricted practices, their use, their policy and legislative context. Practical guidance and training is required around the appropriate use of these practices and alternative approaches to ensure they are only used as a measure of last resort. Language was also incredibly important to all parents as well as professionals. The use of jargon sometimes meant that parents were not always able to fully appreciate the extent of the restrictive practice used on their child. There have been examples of using terms like calm room for seclusion and warm hugs or safe handling for restraint. The professional language has been used as a barrier that left parents feeling too intimidated to try to breach it. So we make a recommendation that information regarding any policy, guidance and legislation on restrictive practices should be made publicly available and easy to read with alternative accessible formats available. Children with additional needs often communicate and you heard that from the young person who spoke to us. They often communicate their distress through behaviours that may be considered disruptive in educational settings, making training essential to support school staff to understand children's need and minimise restrictive practices. Training was continually raised in discussions, as was the fact that there were differences in the levels of training needed between special and mainstream schools. And the school survey showed that 88% of the special schools who responded stated that they had received training, whereas only 23% of the mainstream schools said they'd received training on physical interventions. A number of schools, particularly in the mainstream sector, stated that they'd requested training but had none, and none was offered, with a number having to source and fund it for themselves. Schools emphasised the need for more specialist training on positive behaviour support, early intervention and prevention, and in managing pupils' distressed behaviours. There was a strong support for the use of early intervention and practices of de-escalation and positive behavioural support as a way of minimising the use of restrictive practices. However, lack of resource and support for teachers was a huge barrier in implementing best practice. Schools acknowledged that use of restrictive practices on pupils can be challenging, distressing, and emotional on the children as well as the staff. There is also a deep sense of fear from teachers in all educational settings regarding the practical application of restrictive practices, particularly in misapplying restraints and hurting a child or becoming culpable for potential legal action against them. There was a strong emphasis that teaching staff did not want to use restrictive practices, and it is not a decision that is taken lightly. Any training should not be about what restrictive practices are or how to restrain children, but should be rights-based, child-centred, trauma-informed, providing guidance on therapeutic interventions and de-escalation techniques. Training must focus on increasing the child's capacity to identify each child's communication and learning needs and understand when and how to intervene. It must outline the importance of child and family-based approaches involving the child's parents and carers in developing action plans in advance. Each of our children are unique individuals, so the plan for de-escalation or seeing any trigger signs has to be unique to that child, and we need to take time to make sure that happens. So we make a recommendation with regard to teacher training, accredited teacher training, both pre and post qualification, and that any new policy should be accompanied by an accredited training framework and supportive infrastructure to ensure schools have appropriate resources in place to support their pupils and staff in minimising the use of restrictive practices. All additional training should also be made available on areas complementary to reducing restrictive practices, which could include effective communication, awareness of trauma, disability awareness training with a particular focus on children with autism, managing distress behaviour, and of course children's rights. So from the personal experiences shared by parents and carers and teaching staff, the use of restrictive practices can be extremely challenging and can result in negative and long-lasting traumatic experiences for all involved, most particularly for the child. Evidence suggests that for far too many children, there was a lack of pastoral support available, with no consistent direction in how to communicate with parents regarding these incidents. Without a doubt, the most challenging part of the review was listening to the views of parents and carers on their child's experience of restrictive practices. These were harrowing and distressing experiences with lasting trauma for the whole family. There are extensive testimonies from parents in the report, and you will hear more today. Children with additional needs often communicate distress through behaviours that may be considered disruptive. Training is essential to support education professionals to understand a child's needs and minimise the use of restrictive practices in response to a child's expression of distress. Seeing such behaviour through the lens of distress was critical for parents. We have to see the child and not the behaviour, or not only the behaviour. There is clearly a need for more support to staff and schools in relation to ensuring a child-focused, best practice approach to the use of restrictive practices, including, as I've said, de-escalation, therapeutic interventions, and practical application of any guidance. There was an agreement from everyone on the need to identify systemic issues. So we made recommendations that parents and carers should have an opportunity to receive support and training themselves so that they can understand the use of de-escalation and therapeutic interventions as well as restrictive practices. They should have the opportunity to develop their own capacity to ensure that they and their children can contribute to the development of personalised learning plans and be provided with information on the complaints process. Learning support plans or communication passports should be in place for all children with additional needs, with a particular focus on children who are at risk of exhibiting behaviours that are manifestations of distress. Social, emotional and practical support should be provided for all individuals who experience, witness or apply restrictive practices in educational settings, especially children, siblings, parents and carers and classmates, as well as staff members. You'll be pleased to know I'm getting there. The fact that there is evidence that restrictive practices are used more frequently on children with special educational needs or disabilities, whether in special schools or not, means that we should explore this issue as a disability discrimination issue. Furthermore, restrictive practices in educational settings cannot be resolved in isolation, but need to be incorporated into a wider review of culture within the educational setting, making reporting and monitoring critical. All education settings must be able to promote the best interests of all the children in their care, and this can only be achieved by seeing the child and their behaviours as distress rather than as a problem. This is something that parents were really keen was acknowledged. Knowing the child and how they manifest their distress is critical in making the introduction of reasonable adjustments essential. A statement of special educational need should not be required to make reasonable adjustments for children with additional needs, and behaviours should be acknowledged as communication requiring a therapeutic response rather than bad behaviour requiring punishment. So our last two recommendations are around that. All educational settings should be informed by the UNCRC within a child's rights framework, and embed a culture of school values underpinned by the principles of inclusion, the best interests of the child, and the respect for their human rights. The Department of Education and Education Authority should provide support to school leaders in school-based transformation work as required, including changing culture and attitudes towards pupils with additional needs. Resources, training and sharing of good practice should be provided as this happens. People choose to work in education to support all children to learn and to reach their potential. Education staff are children's rights defenders, and we know that they are deeply affected when these rights are not upheld. However, some of the testimonies in this report are amongst the most disturbing I have ever read in my 34-year career. The fact that one child has had this experience in our education system is one child too many. But we know that it's more than one child because we've spoken to their parents and their teachers. It is unacceptable that we do not know how many children have had such experience, and even more disturbing that there may be parents who still do not know that this is or has happened to their children. As parents, the number one thing that we know we have to do is keep our children safe. We have heard from so many parents who were unaware of what their children was experiencing on a regular, if not daily basis. They feel that they have let their child down, and they have, in some cases, been reliving their children's experience every day since. It's not their fault, and the purpose of this work is to ensure that never again will parents be unaware of what is happening to their children in school or anywhere else. There is no situation where a child would be restrained and secluded in such an unregulated manner. So I just want to finish by saying, today is the 30th anniversary of when the UK government ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Our children should not have to wait for another 30 years to have every single one of those 42 rights realised. Thank you.
To a poem written by Kiva Redden about her own daughter's experience of the multiple uses of restraint and seclusion. The poem can be found on the inside back page of both the main and summary reports, which are available obviously on our website. And I'm now going to hand over to Kiva, a parent's poem.
Hello everyone, my name is Kiva, and today I would like to share with you a poem that I wrote about my daughter's experience in school and how it impacted her emotionally and mentally. Childhood was perfect with a few wee friends. Everything was fine when it all made sense. Behaviours worsen, must be difficulties at home. Phone call after phone call, please leave me alone. Teachers and psychologists questioning your parenting, giving you that look like you're not worth anything. Family and friends will soon disappear. No party invitations from either of our peers. Sadness and confusion on your little one's face. Anger and loneliness are what I embraced. Years with no answer, no support nor care. Even now with a diagnosis, I still worry and despair. Bright and intelligent, she will do well, but we don't understand her, so we'll punish her as well. Exclusion, suspensions, isolations and much more. What's happened to this place? Is there no care anymore? No understanding, nurturing or empathy has left my child feeling unwanted and empty. Embarrassed, ashamed, even made to feel guilt. Why can't you understand? This isn't her fault. No patience, no awareness or training yourselves. A blade to her arm as she blames herself. Broken and beaten by authority figures. Do you realise you are now her triggers? She will stim and mask, even cry and roar. But if you give her a chance, you will soon see her soar. I am tired and drained. I wish it would all go away. But this misunderstanding, unfortunately, will stay. Her brain may be different, but it's not broken or wrong. And I will fight for her rights, no matter how long. I see her worth. I see her potential. I also see her challenges, which are not intentional. You don't see what I see, but let me tell you it's there. A beautiful young woman with so much love and care. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Kiva for reading that poem. To some of you, Deirdre Shakespeare needs no introduction. Her tireless campaign of Harry's Law has been discussed in the Education Committee, the Northern Ireland Assembly Chamber, and has been recognised internationally. Deirdre is going to share Harry's experiences and explain why she began campaigning on restraint and seclusion in schools. Over to Deirdre.
Neither seen nor heard. These words echo a draconian education system where many children have been and continue to be harmed. Language is a barrier used to hide the severity of these practices, which are hidden from sight. I want to thank Kula, our Children's Commissioner, for this important human rights-based review and hearing from countless children and their families who have been significantly affected by the use of restraint and seclusion in their education. The impact cannot be overstated. I also want to thank Fiona Cole for her dedication to ensuring the voices of children and their experiences were reflected in this report. We hope that this report will further the DE's review of restrictive practices in schools across Northern Ireland. My name is Deirdre Shakespeare, and I am Harry's mummy. And today I'm going to share with you Harry's story. We made a horrifying discovery that mechanical and physical restraint was used on our 5-year-old son. This is Harry, and this is his story. I may be a little biased, but Harry is a beautiful little boy. He's our youngest son, and both my husband and I are so very proud of him. Harry is autistic, he has an intellectual disability, he's non-speaking, and he also presents with a cerebral visual impairment. Despite all these great challenges in his life, he's a very happy, placid little boy who has sadly experienced excessive use of mechanical and physical restraint in his education. We could never have imagined what Harry's school day was like, and we did never imagine the fight that we would have to endure to defend his human rights when his end-of-year playbooks were placed into my hands. It was the day that our world fell apart. I want to stress before we go any further that there may be images that you may find distressing, and today I'm sharing Harry's voice. It's painful to share these images, but you will see in these pictures that Harry's facial expressions tell you what he cannot verbalise in his own words. I'm sharing these pictures of Harry today in good faith, that they will not be used outside of this platform and that they should not be copied for any other purpose or shared on other platforms. But it is important that Harry's voice is heard, and he must not be silenced. Mechanical and physical restraint. What did this look like in Harry's education? He did use a feeding chair many times at home, and he would use this to communicate that he was hungry, but it was never agreed that the school could use a chair for anything other than feeding our son. We noticed that our beautiful little boy became withdrawn at home, distant and detached. This was odd and completely out of his character. Harry experienced high levels of anxiety around any sudden movement or touch. He would defecate in fear when we would leave our home. He experienced night terrors and panic attacks. He became so afraid of the dark, and his world fell into darkness at school. He didn't want to get dressed for school, and he didn't want to get on the bus. He would cower in fear, and this impact has been profound. It has had a lasting impact on his life, even today. Why did we not do something? That guilt of not acting on suspicions earlier will continue to live with me as I failed as Harry's mummy to recognise the behaviour that he was displaying was a cry for help. I believed and I trusted these professionals, but I couldn't see beyond those school walls where the horror lay and became normalised as Harry was routinely tortured every day under the guise of education. Harry was routinely mechanically restrained in his special school, and on one of those occasions that we know of, they tied his feet to a chair. They used a lap belt across his waist, they even placed a table on there, and they held his hand while he was imprisoned in that chair. Humiliated, Harry was made indifferent, and he was stripped of his human rights. All of this because he had a disability. He couldn't process or cope with the demands like his non-disabled peers. He was punished. Harry wasn't viewed as a human being, and in fact, humanity was just a mess. And you must remember that Harry is a fully mobile child. Harry was contained to perform in school activities. A chair was used for playing, feeding, water play, messy play, schoolwork, and he was wheeled in the chair around the school. They took away his liberty and his independence. He should have been flourishing, but instead, Harry was broken. Mechanical restraint was used for compliance and control. His peers played freely in the playground while Harry was restrained, harnessed with the leads of reins which trailed behind him as he played in the enclosed play frames on the school grounds. It was really just barbaric what our little boy endured. He couldn't tell us, so he was showing us through his behaviour that something was wrong. Harry often looked absent and lost. He would rock back and forth, bang his head off the sofa at home, and we would catch him staring into the corner of the room. His mind was broken. He was crippled mentally with pain, so he took himself to a place where no one could touch him. Even when Harry appeared distressed, they didn't stop. His life was consumed with the use of force, forced to participate in everything. Harry was mechanically and physically restrained. He was strapped to a chair with nowhere to go. He couldn't escape. All this just so that he could be seen participating in class cookery sessions. And yet, despite showing clear signs of distress, they didn't stop. Harry also came home with bruising and friction marks. No one would ever tell us what happened, and we still didn't know that school had permission to restrain a child. Yet, a school has to report if a child falls and cuts their knee or bumps their head. Harry's social worker alerted me that what the school were using on our son was called mechanical restraint. And empowered with this knowledge, my doubts and fears had an answer. Soon after, I received the playbooks with some of the pictures that I have shared with you today. And when we complained to the school, they told me that there was no evidence that the school failed regarding safeguarding our son, or that he was treated with any less dignity or respect than his peers. We were soon to find out that children such as our son are viewed as unreliable witnesses to the abuse that they suffer, and we couldn't protect him. We made a complaint to social services and a police investigation was launched. The PPS told us that the complaint didn't come from Harry, who's a vulnerable young child. And from all the evidence and information, they did not consider Harry would be able to provide such a complaint which could be relied upon as evidence. Our children are powerless to this system. Discrimination starts with disabled people at an early age, and that inequality is branching out into society as acceptable. People don't see a human being first. You see a disability, and this barbaric treatment is normalised and accepted, even by those who are supposed to protect them. We were in a dark place, and we needed hope. So we lobbied for Harry's law, and today we thank Kula, the Children's Commissioner, for her recommendations in Neither Seen Nor Heard, which support what we have called for in Harry's law mandate. My husband and I, along with Adele Boyd, an independent social worker and co-founder of Harry's Law, met and lobbied Chris Little, MLA of the Alliance Party. Finally, we were heard and we were believed, and we no longer felt alone. We lobbied legislators across all parties, urging them to take action and lawfully ensure statutory protections of our children's human rights from abuse and disability discrimination, where the use of force is being used to discipline our children who are distressed in their environment. BASRA also released a policy statement outlining the damaging psychological and emotional effects on children and young people. Just some of the recommendations that we called for were mandatory recording and reporting, mandatory training, definition of a last resort, mandatory inclusion of non-aversive positive support strategies, legislate for duty of candour, standardised policies and guidance, accountability, statutory duty for social workers to investigate any parental concerns. ICARS gained support for Harry's Law from socialite Paris Hilton, a survivor of restrictive practices. Brave families came forward to ICARS, and a few of those families are here today to share their experience. To Kiva, Emma, Blaine, and to one little boy who bravely opened this review today and shared his harrowing experience of his education. You're all just incredible. We will continue to campaign for Harry's Law to ensure robust statutory protections are enshrined in law. Guidance has failed our children for years. It's tokenistic. It's an unrealistic expectation of faith and trust of a flawed system with no oversight, poor safeguarding, no accountability. Does this sound child-centred to you? We must ensure training has standardised, robust accreditation, but we can't have small children in schools with disabilities subjected to excessive physical force. We cannot be teaching staff to use the same forceful restraining holds on children that are applied to men and women in prisons or individuals in high security hospitals. It's just not ethically or morally okay to do this to small children. It's punitive, and the focus should be on an elimination of unnecessary use of restraint in schools. People have become desensitized to the trauma and harm caused to children, so this language is used to give this practice credibility. Families are bravely stepping forward and sharing their stories. They want you to hear their voice. We want to make a change together. Children throughout the UK depend on the people's voice, and we have to use that to protect them. We need to understand the function of the distress and meet the needs of our children. See them as a person and not just the disability. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you to Deirdre. In May 2021, the Education Committee brought forward a motion calling on the Education Minister to urgently develop new guidance on restraint and seclusion. We will now hear from the Education Committee Chair, Chris Little, MLA.
My name is Chris Little. I'm an Alliance MLA for East Belfast and Chairperson of the Northern Ireland Assembly Education Committee. I first became aware of the harm caused by the inappropriate use of restraint when I met Deirdre and Rodney Shakespeare in 2019. It was extremely challenging to witness the trauma Deirdre was experiencing in her fight to be believed, for accountability for the harm caused to her son Harry, and for the rights of every child to be safe in school. I gave my commitment that day to support the campaign for a Harry's Law to ensure that no such harm is experienced by any other child. And further to that meeting and engagement with the British Association of Social Workers in Northern Ireland, I emailed the Children's Commissioner for Northern Ireland, Kula Yasuma, to ask if she was aware of the inappropriate use of restraint and seclusion on children in schools in Northern Ireland. I received a very warm and friendly rebuke to advise me that the Children's Commissioner for Northern Ireland was well on the case of this important matter. Neither seen nor heard is evidence of just how seriously the Children's Commissioner is taking this matter. It is a vital contribution to achieving the aim of a new legislative framework for a more therapeutic, rights-based approach and last resort use of restraint that further compels urgent action from the Minister and Department of Education. I commend the Children's Commissioner and her team, including Fiona Cole, for this comprehensive and extremely important rights-based review on the use of restraint and seclusion in educational settings. As chairperson of the Education Committee, I've consistently supported the amazing teachers and non-teaching staff in schools, particularly special schools in Northern Ireland. However, in the absence of appropriate Department of Education guidance, training and accountability on restraint, serious mistakes have been made by schools, boards of governors and employing authorities, which have caused significant harm to children that they were entrusted to protect. As neither heard states, the work we do on this matter is for the children who have been harmed, the parents and guardians who have experienced distress and trauma because of the harm their children have suffered, and for the parents, guardians, and on most occasions, mothers who were not believed, who risked their reputation, mental health and well-being to challenge people of standing in their local community to hold child protection feelings of respected institutions to account, who became experts in law and policy and who just refused to give up. I welcome and commend the findings and recommendations of Neither Seen Nor Heard, which add to an increasing consensus around the actions that need to be taken on restraint and seclusion. They include statutory guidance on restraint that is based on therapeutic, non-aversive, positive behaviour approaches with restraint as a last resort, definitions of restraint based on the UNCRC, funded mandatory training for all staff working with children, the mandatory recording and reporting of all incidents of restraint, and the abolition of the use of seclusion. Harrowing evidence and testimony from parents of children who have experienced the use of inappropriate restraint and seclusion. We must make sure that no other child suffers as they did. Existing guidance is now over 20 years old and has not been updated to reflect children's rights protections and best practices adopted in other jurisdictions. New guidance must be focused on best practice approaches and on the needs of the pupil, and that their rights should be enshrined in the UNCRC to give equal access to education for all children, including those with additional needs. It is, Commissioner states, important that we don't underestimate the difficulty of some situations for teachers, non-teaching staff and parents. We need teachers to have the support, skills and understanding of techniques to ensure that they are able to respond in the best interests of the child. That is exacerbated by the huge pressure on special educational needs provision in Northern Ireland, and it is a challenge to which the Department of Education must also respond. The new framework must, of course, be produced in partnership with parents and relevant stakeholders, and I'm encouraged that the Department of Education's inclusion of parent advocates and carers in its review process, as well as recent updates that the review working group hopes to report in March 2022. Neither seen nor heard will be a critical contribution to this review, and I thank the Children's Commissioner and everyone involved with its production. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Chris. I would now like to introduce Emma McAfee, a parent whose son who has autism has regrettably experienced multiple uses of restraint and seclusion in a school from primary 4 onwards. Emma.
This is my autistic son Elliot, and things started going wrong for him at school in P4 with the introduction of a new principal, vice principal and special provision teacher. Prior to their involvement with my son, he loved going to school and there had been no difficulties at all managing and meeting his needs appropriately. Without provocation, they started to take a behavioural only approach with Elliot, forgetting he was autistic altogether. We desperately tried to get them to see his distressed behaviours, but they treated him like he was a delinquent heading straight for prison rather than a child on the spectrum whose needs were not being met. Elliot would experience autistic shutdowns and the anxiety freeze response regularly. He would become stuck, unable to talk, move or comply, but the school only saw a defiant child who was choosing not to comply and subjected him to restraint. Fear of restraint led Elliot to absconding, triggered by the anxiety flight response, but the school only saw a disruptive and controlling child who, according to them, knew exactly what he was doing and subjected him to restraint. Their actions and lack of appropriate support kept Elliot in a constant state of distress, so it was no surprise that he then had difficulty self-regulating, which then led to frequent meltdowns. The school saw this as further opportunities to subject him to restraint. Restraints are brutal and traumatising. It's a legal form of abuse. He suffered a relentless cycle of discrimination and abuse that there wasn't anything we could do to make them stop because there's no law to say that they couldn't do it. The Children's Law Centre called it a legal grey area. It drove my child to not only want to kill himself, but to attempt to do so. My child survived, but another may not. We need to end the abuse that is happening to our children in schools all over Northern Ireland under the guise of reasonable force. It is never safe or therapeutic. It has left my child with lasting emotional and psychological trauma. My recommendations to the Department of Education would include a less tedious and time-consuming complaints process. My complaint started in September 2018 and is still ongoing. That's 3 years, 3 months and counting. Having schools investigate themselves is pointless, unfair and biased, as they are more worried about the school's reputation and doing damage control than they are in addressing their failures and holding those responsible accountable. A ban on the use of restraint for compliance and discipline purposes altogether. It should only ever be used when all other preventative measures and de-escalation techniques have been exhausted, or when they are in immediate danger or putting others in immediate danger. Mandatory and comprehensive recording of restraints. Their records should include the preventative measures and de-escalation techniques used, a description of the events that led up to the restraint being used, to help them identify potential triggers, what restraint was used, by who and for how long, an evaluation of the incident so that the schools can learn from and improve their practices. It should also include any changes they recommend to the child's provision and support. The pupils' views must also be recorded, as well as the parents' views after they have read the report, and it must be recorded in their own words. A full copy should then be shared with parents for their records. Mandatory record keeping of meetings with parents, which must be signed by both the school and parents as being a true and accurate representation of the meeting, a copy of which should then be shared with parents for the records. This keeps everyone true to their word. I would like to see CCTV in all classrooms, halls and stairways of schools. It has been successfully used in the health and social care sector for many years, providing much needed safeguarding, protection and accountability for all. We also need a standalone law specifically drawn up to address the use of restraint on children with additional needs. It is used disproportionately on our children, so having specific statutory guidance, it will put in place much needed safeguarding and protections, and also, should the need arise, provide justice and accountability for failures.
Thank you to Emma. Now it's time for our Q&A panel discussion, and we invite our virtual audience watching today, if you have any questions or comments for the panel, please put them into the chat function and we'll get to as many as possible, and apologies in advance for any that we don't have time to get to. Our panel today is obviously the Commissioner for Children and Young People, Coola, and we also have Orla Fitzsimmons, CEO and Nurse Consultant, Parent Care Advocacy of Parent Action Northern Ireland, and Parent Care of Children with Additional Needs. Parent Action is a human rights-based organisation which works with parent carers of children and adults with disabilities and lifelong health conditions to advocate for their children's rights in accessing vital public services, and we're also one of our key partner organisations supporting families' participation in our research for this review. Dr. Graham Galt is President of the National Association of Head Teachers, and in May 2021, NICCY produced a position paper on the use of restrictive practice in schools in Northern Ireland, outlining their concerns at the lack of statutory guidance and appropriate training on the use of restrictive practices, and this also included concerns regarding the use of seclusion and deprivation of liberty in educational settings as well. NICCY published 12 calls for action, including legislative reform and publication of accompanying standardised guidance for schools, developed in partnership with key stakeholders including parents, carers, schools and unions. They've also called for a timetable for their development to be published immediately. Ricky Irwin is Director of Inclusion and Wellbeing in the Department of Education, and we wish to thank the Department for their support in terms of our parental engagement work to inform this report. Ricky's team is undertaking the Department's own review of Restraint and Seclusion, which we very much welcome and which the Permanent Secretary referred to earlier. This is the opportunity to effect the real and positive change we all want to see across policy and practice in the best interests of our children and young people. And finally, we were to have Blaine McCartney, a parent of a child with special educational needs and who has advocated for change in relation to restraint and seclusion in educational settings for some time. Unfortunately, Blaine has laryngitis and has given his apologies. We're very lucky that Emma McAfee has very kindly offered to step in and sit on the panel as well. But before we get to that, Blaine did give us a statement that he did ask us to read out, and Fiona Cole, who was the lead for this work for NICCY, is going to read that now. Fiona.
Thank you. This statement is from Blaine McCartney. Unfortunately, I am unable to join the panel today due to developing laryngitis. Firstly, I'd like to thank all staff officers in NICCY and the Commissioner for getting us to this point and continuing to highlight the important issues. Restraining and placing a child in restraint is fundamentally wrong and should only be applied as a last resort. The current legislation needs to be changed and updated to protect the most vulnerable children and young people in society, to ensure that their human and UNCRC rights are protected and afforded to them like the rest of us in society. Governance arrangements within schools and reporting systems need overhauled. A parent carer must have a legal right to know if their child has been restrained or secluded. This needs to be recorded and reported to parents and carers and shouldn't just be viewed as good practice. With annual auditing being carried out by the EA Department of Education, there needs to be an overhaul and policy legislative alignment of existing DE policies and align and make them similar to that of the Department of Health and Department of Justice. Staff in schools working with children with additional needs require and deserve sufficient training to allow them to feel confident in completing their job roles. With regular advice and multidisciplinary work completed by working in partnership with health professionals to ensure and update skills and knowledge base to ensure best practice. I sincerely hope that policymakers support these recommendations and bring updated legislation forward and mandate it within the next Assembly term. As a parent of a child with a disability who's pre-verbal, and it's extremely disappointing that this wasn't completed through the current Assembly mandate. Vulnerable children and young people will now have to wait until at least 2022-2023 to be afforded the same rights and protections as the rest of society. As a society, we have an obligation to provide these protections. No parent should feel powerless in trying to protect their child to ensure they're safe from harm and that their rights are protected. I fully endorse these recommendations outlined today by the Commissioner and her staff. This is just the beginning to ensure a systematic change and culture within the education system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fiona, and thank you very much, Blaine, for sending the statement in to be read today. We're going to move on to our panel discussion now, and I'm inviting each member of the panel to make their opening statement, and hopefully we'll try and keep things concise so that we can cover as many questions as possible. And I'd like to call on Ricky first, Ricky Irwin from the Department of Education.
Maria, thanks very much, and thanks for inviting me to be part of the panel today. Before I provide an update on the department's work, I'd just like to reiterate what our Permanent Secretary, Mark Brown, said at the beginning of the event, and that is that the department is listening and is listening to you. This is an issue the Minister has taken a significant interest in, and it's very keen that the department review reports in a timely and comprehensive fashion. Our work on the use of restrictive practices in education settings has benefited from your input already, and I can assure you that we still need your support. The recommendations which we will bring forward to the Minister, including any legislative change, will be informed by you. The department's review is looking at current legislation, policies, guidance and training, current practices, including local audits or reports, ongoing work in other jurisdictions, research reports and evidence of best practice. It's also looking at current recording, monitoring and follow-up processes and complaints and issues arising to identify weaknesses in existing guidance and areas for action. Any recommendations for change, including whether legislative change is needed, will be subject to ministerial consideration and approval. The department welcomes the NICCY report launched today, and indeed NICCY is part of the reference group for our review. It also accepted a request to take forward additional parental engagement on our behalf. I can assure you all that both NICCY's parental engagement report and the neither seen nor heard report will be taken into consideration as the department's work on this important area progresses. Engagement has been and will continue to be central to our review, which is due to be completed by March 2022. We have an obligation to get this right, and our children and young people deserve no less. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Ricky. I'll go next to Orla.
Thanks very much, Maria. Sorry, I was muted there just because somebody's just come in from school, so I didn't want to be interrupted. Thanks very much to Kula and the team for the invitation to contribute to the panel and the introduction as well, Maria. Thanks very much. we just wanted to say, really, we're parent carers who've been working with Parent Action are absolutely delighted about the child's rights focus that NICCY's very comprehensive review has brought to the issue of restraint and seclusion in educational settings. Parent Action very much welcomes the NICCY Neither Seen Nor Heard report and its recommendations as well. I would like to thank at the outset the parent carers who bravely contributed their child's experiences of restraint and seclusion in our schools and nurseries in Northern Ireland, the horrific impacts on them, their children with additional needs and siblings of these unlegislated, unregulated, uncommunicated restrictive practices in schools against the most vulnerable of our children over years in both mainstream and special educational settings. As I was the Parent Action researcher privileged to carry out a number of one-to-one interviews with parent carers whose children had these experiences as part of the NICCY review, I have to say it has been one of the hardest pieces of work I've ever undertaken in my 30 years as working as a community children's nurse in the health service in Northern Ireland, a health researcher and a parent care advocate in Northern Ireland, and also as the parent care of a young man with additional needs as well. So I'd really like to also thank Fiona Cole, Policy and Campaigns Officer in NICCY, and the Parent Action Board, who provided crucial guidance and support to myself in facilitating parents to have their voices heard in this work. And as well, the other supporter organisations who, without them, engagement with these isolated, traumatised parent carers on these very difficult issues would not have been possible. So Parent Action Parent Carers with lived experience of their children being restrained or secluded in their educational setting have asked me to comment just on the findings in answer to the questions that any of the audience has around the policy and guidance and legislation that needs to come out of this. Parents have also sent comments in around how parents can be involved, how their ideas for involvement and support in both the Department of Education, the Education Authority, school leaders and teachers and health and social care staff who are an integral part of our children accessing their education, and then the Department of Health in overcoming the barriers that parent carers feel to having their voices heard, but particularly in raising public interest concerns such as harmful practices like restraint and seclusion in schools. So thanks very much for the introduction, and I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Charla. I'd like to move now to Graham, Dr. Graham Galt.
Hi, thanks, Mairead. The report is harrowing to read. The evidence from parents and from their children is harrowing to hear. But I'm very glad that this report has been produced. I'm very glad of the evidence that has been gathered in this process. I represent school leaders. I'm the president of the National Association of Head Teachers. The majority of school leaders in Northern Ireland are members. And on behalf of school leaders, I want to say we want to see change in this area. Every time this has happened, it has represented a failure in our system, and we want to see change in this. We love the children. We want our provision in frontline education to meet the needs of our children as it is appropriate for each individual child. And you should interpret my presence here with you today as a sign that the frontline workforce, particularly our school leaders who I represent, are on the same page. We want the same thing. And I am really excited about the opportunity of working alongside Ricky Irwin, folks across the department and the Education Authority and the other groups in the education system to improve our provision for our most vulnerable children. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Graham. I'd like to move quickly then on to Emma. Emma, some opening comments from yourself.
I just want to say that I'm very happy to be here to replace Blaine. Unfortunately, he can't be here. I just wanted to say that it's hard when you have lived experience of restraint and seclusion. It's hard going through the complaints process. Professionals their voice is given a higher priority over all parents. We're taught, the system tells us that they know better and that we don't. They're held up the gospel over us parents. So when it comes to raising concerns or complaints, we're gaslighted. Our agendas, our intentions, our ability to parent is called into question, and it makes it very, very hard to navigate the system to get accountability. Having no law or mandatory guidance makes it very difficult for us parents to navigate the complaints process, again, to get accountability. It just makes it impossible. It allows the cycle of discrimination and abuse to continue. And I am very pleased to have read the report, the findings and the recommendations by NICCY. I think it is going to go a long way if the Department of Education listen and take them on board to breaking that cycle and making sure that our children are actually safe and listened to in school.
Thank you very much for that, Emma. I'm going to now take some of the questions that are coming through in the chat function. And again, apologies if we don't get to all of them, but we'll cover as many as we can. I have one here from Rachel Hogan. What steps are being taken to ensure that human rights protections are applied consistently across departments? And I think I'll go first of all to Ricky.
Thanks, Maria, and thanks, Rachel, for the question. I think what we're seeing now right across government, within departments, within the executive, is much more of a human rights approach to the development of policies. Certainly in relation to this review of seclusion and restraint in the Department of Education, we've been very mindful of the human rights legislative framework, the various conventions, the legal context, and I think the shift towards ensuring that human rights are central to the consideration of policy reviews. So I can't speak for other departments, but I can certainly speak on this issue on behalf of the Department of Education, that is a central tenet of our review. And I think the Neither Seen Nor Heard report has actually emphasised the human rights framework within which any new guidance and if there's legislation would actually be set. So I think that has been very helpful in that context.
Thanks very much for that, Ricky. And I'm sure everybody will welcome the commitment from the department in terms of the human rights protections and context that will be used to inform the final guidance and documents going forward. Kula, I think you wanted to come in.
Just to add my welcome to Ricky's remark, but I think just in response to Rachel's question, that we do need to see more being done structurally to embed human rights and children's rights, particularly across government. So NICCY have been working very hard with all government departments around child's rights impact assessments and the importance that there is a child's rights framework in everything that government does. But also we were very clear in our advice to the Bill of Rights Committee, albeit 20 years too late, and goodness knows how long it will actually take to get it in place in view of the fact that work stalled. But what we said very clearly to the Bill of Rights Committee, and in that work for Bill of Rights, that any Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland has to be enshrined in legislation, and within that, the whole of the UNCRC, kit and caboodle, has to be incorporated into domestic legislation. We need to learn from what's happening in Scotland, and we need to do something similar, if not better, here in Northern Ireland. So it's great that we're hearing from some government departments, as we just have, how children's rights are going to be enshrined, but that should be across all government departments, across every nook and cranny in government. And the only way we're going to do that is by making it mandatory. God, I'm a big fan of mandatory at the moment, but by making it mandatory, incorporating the UNCRC. But I really look forward to seeing the rollout of child rights impact assessment across all government departments.
Thanks for that, Kula. Does anyone else on the panel want to come in on that before I move on to the next question? Happy enough. We have a question coming in here now from Deirdre Vaughan. And it's about teachers and what they would feel would be the most important factor in the implementation of these recommendations. And Graham, I'm going to put you on the spot for that one.
Problem. Well, assuming that we do go forward so that we have a clear legislative position and guidance, that's what my profession needs to be able to deliver as fairly and safely for all of our children consistently across all of our schools and all of our sectors. Assuming that we do get to that position, what also needs to happen is appropriate resourcing and appropriate training for our school staff. And the other things that you've mentioned, of course, as well, in terms of recording procedures and so on. But listen, the context of our schools at the moment, over the past 8 to 10 years, hundreds of millions of pounds have been taken out of the frontline education budget. And I'm excited to hear Ricky talking about the review. I'm excited about the review being based in thinking about international best practice and human rights standards and so on. But I am anxious about what is going to come out the other side if it's not supported fully in terms of funding, resourcing and training, because I'm from a mainstream background. So I have been a principal of a mainstream primary school. Every class in my school has 30 children or more. And the range of needs in the reality of a classroom is huge. And I wish that throughout my career as a teacher in a mainstream school, I could say that I have always consistently been able to meet every single child at their individual point of need. But I know I haven't been able to do that. I also know that if I experienced a child in my classroom as a teacher, and now I've been a principal for a decade, and I needed to restrain that a child because something was going to happen that was a danger to that child, I wouldn't know how to do it. I've never been trained in how to make that kind of contact with a child. And I know that if I found myself in those circumstances, I would make mistakes because I don't know how to do it. Now, I'm talking to you as a president of an organization that represents hundreds of school leaders, and I've never experienced that training, and I've never had any of my staff receive that training. So I would say that as we move forward, the thing that the teaching profession needs in all sectors is a huge commitment and a very clear commitment for resources in terms of money, in terms of appropriate one-to-one adult assistance for the children and for appropriate to their statement and what they need, and very quick access to that kind of stuff, and also very clear, regular training.
Absolutely. You'll not get any argument from us on that one, Graham. I think Kula wants to make a couple of comments here as well.
Again, just to reiterate what Graham said, you know, we can't just pile stuff, responsibilities and frameworks and mandatory obligations on our schools and our teachers and our school leaders without giving them the support and the finances and all the resources that they need. So that's absolutely right. But we know that there is training available, and we in the report we do enumerate some of that, and we've heard both from St Mary's and Stranmillis about what training they offer. And also, as I said, for those of you who stayed awake during my speech, as I said in my speech, that this can't be seen in isolation. We published Too Little Too Late around provision for children in mainstream with special educational needs. This is part of a bigger framework about how we support our children and how we support our staff who work with them and how we support their parents around how children, particularly those with special educational need, particularly those who are non-verbal, particularly those who are traumatised, how we support them to enjoy their right to education. And that isn't necessarily cost neutral, but it is definitely something that we need to do.
Thank you for that one, Kula. I'm going to move on. I have a question here from Elizabeth McGrath, who's obviously experienced a child being left to walk about in a bloody shirt, as she describes it here. And Elizabeth is asking what is being done about children self-harming in school. And I know it's quite a broad question, but I would like to maybe get a wee bit of feedback then from Orla and Emma on that one before we go to anyone else.
Well, with my son in particular, when I approached the school about his tendency to, well, his suicidal ideation, his tendency to put himself at risk and in unsafe situations, and this was before it developed to suicidal attempts. They had very little to come back to me with, other than, oh, we can remove his tie. We'll make sure somebody goes into the toilet with him. It was silly things rather than real support. That's what I was wanting. That's what my child was needing at the time. So yeah, I would like to see from the education system, when a child is presenting with suicidal ideation and self-harm, some real commitment to putting in place support for them, whether it is counselling, more one-to-one. There needs to be more around their mental health, supporting their mental health and well-being, because that's what prevents it from getting to the point of, yes, I'm telling you now that I'm in trouble, to actually taking the leap to wanting to kill themselves. We need to prevent them from getting to that point. I don't feel that the school heard us, to be fair, I think it's definitely down again to training, resources, provision. We need more of a commitment with that from the education.
And Orla?
Yes, thanks, Maria. Thanks a million, Emma, for that. And that's just bringing it on, Emma, what you were saying from your presentation earlier as well. And the focus on the fact that Kula was talking about distress behaviours, and that's the influence of parents into this review. They previously were called challenging behaviours, and they're not challenging to the child, and they certainly aren't challenging. They're challenging to the people who don't understand what the child's trying to communicate. And the child's trying to communicate distress, the child's trying to communicate anxiety. And self-harm is again, and suicide attempts are again a very common experience in the parents that we interviewed, and parents that we work with in Parent Action all the time, that children who have communication difficulties, regardless of their disability diagnosis, experience anxiety because they don't understand what's expected of them in the school setting. The sensory overload in the classroom perhaps is not being addressed for children with particular needs. There's too much going on, there's too much noise. And then whenever the children try to self-regulate themselves, which is what stimming is, or everything else. I mean, my son walks around and repeats YouTube dialogue from videos he's been watching, but that's his calming mechanism. And what parents were telling us through the research mostly was, that's not recognised by staff, and it's also not recognised by the health staff who are in the schools, particularly in special schools. So I think what the focus really on regarding self-harm and support is to prevent it. And some of our parent carers, the majority of the parent carers that we work with who contributed to this research, but also who we've been working with, the themes of experience they're talking about is what we need is early intervention so the children don't get scared, so that the children aren't anxious and distressed because they don't understand what's being asked of them in school, or they feel that they're being treated differently, as that really brave young man said at the beginning of the presentation. And it's a common theme of, you're not seeing me, you're not hearing me. Just because I can't speak doesn't mean I've nothing to say, that I don't have. Sorry.
No, thank you for that, Orla.
I don't have my own rights and my own feelings about things. So as in answer to the question then, it's really about, our parent carers have been saying to us, what we need is early intervention, mental health, first aid training for parents and for the teachers who are looking at our children, because each child is unique and they communicate in a unique way. So that's what we should be focusing on in order to prevent mental health crises, which is what meltdowns are in mainstream and special schools, and to prevent children being so desperate for help that they're not being listened to, that they have to self-harm, or they have to consider
no longer being here, which is just appalling. So I think if we bring it back to the child and listen to the child, and Kula will tell me all about voice and the importance of the child's voice. When a child is non-verbal, the next person you should be asking about the child's best interests and best wishes is the person who knows them best. And 9 times out of 10, in fact, 10 times out of 10, that'll be their parents.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so that's why we need to start listening to parents to prevent and intervene in a strategic way to stop
and
getting to the stage where children are so distressed that they're having to self-harm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, thanks, Sarah. I'm just mindful of time, and there's a lot of questions coming in, and we're trying to get through as many as we can. And I'm mindful as well just that Ricky might want to mention, obviously, the department's own emotional health and wellbeing framework. But I'm going to move on, if you don't mind, to another question. We have one from Chris Little, MLA. What is the DE response to the specific recommendations, including the statutory guidance and mandatory training and recording? That's one for you, Ricky.
Thanks, Maria. And yes, if we had more time, I would talk more about the emotional health and wellbeing framework that was launched earlier this year, and the commitment from both the Department of Education and Health to fund various projects in that space, including looking at early intervention, but that's one for another day. I suppose in relation to the report and the recommendations, obviously we're only in receipt of them this week, a couple of days ago. We will need time to consider the report. It's very comprehensive, but my initial views are that in terms of the department's review, this is certainly a very, very helpful report, covers the areas that the review within the department was looking at, and makes very, very clear recommendations which have been coming through in our engagement with other stakeholders on this particular issue. So I wouldn't want to preempt the outcome of the department's review, because we still have work to do on this, but that I suppose would be my initial response, Maria.
Thanks for that, Ricky. That's very helpful, actually. I'm going to move on to a question from Nicola Brogan. Emily, how do you see full engagement and consultation with children and young people and their parents on an ongoing basis? And I know Kula will want to come in on this one as well. So again, putting you slightly on the spot, Ricky, but also very happy to hear from Graham as well.
Well, just very briefly, because I'm sure others want to come in on this, Maria. Yes, of course, ongoing consultation and feedback from parents is absolutely vital, not just in this issue, but every issue and policy that the department is concerned with. We were very pleased to work in partnership with NICCY in terms of parental engagement on this particular issue. And I have been directly involved in talking to parents who have lived experience as well on this issue. And I can give that commitment that we will continue to do that as we carry on with this review. And indeed, after the review, when we're in a period of implementation. So hopefully that can provide some assurances around that. Thanks, Maria.
Thanks for that, Ricky. Graham, did you want to come in on this one?
Yeah, absolutely. Consultation is wonderful and should happen. Consultation also needs to be perceived and understood by all participants that it genuinely is consultation, and that the outcomes aren't already, a done deal, but that the outcomes actually will reflect the evidence that's gathered. Maria, if you don't mind, I just also mention that the Education Training Inspectorate at the moment are doing some work on preventative safeguarding, which is involving visits out to a number of schools to look at provisions they might have in place to prevent the likes of self-harm and so on. I suspect that one of the outcomes of their experiences out in schools will be that, again, there is a significant lack of training. I see on the EA website there has been training in the past on self-harm, last 2018 as far as I could see, but that training is again something that should be provided in person on the other side of COVID to everyone who's in contact with young people.
Absolutely. And obviously, Kula wants to make some comments here as well, because we know that parents have repeatedly highlighted the need to listen to their children and to see their children, hence the name of the report. Kula.
So I think it's just obviously agree with everything everyone said. I think often the word we don't use, we talk about engagement, we talk about co-design, we talk about consultation, we talk about, what we don't talk about is partnership as much when we're talking about partnership with parents and partnership with children. And actually going forward, what we need to do is work in partnership with our parents. So it's not only in the development of the guidance, not only in the development of the legislation, but it's also in the agreement of the procedures and the processes. It's also in the development and the delivery of the training. It's, you know, that this is a transactional relationship going forward, and consulting with parents is not and with children and young people is not a one-off. It's a continual process, because if we're going to get better at this, if we're going to make restraint a last resort, if we're going to ban seclusion and isolation of children in schools, then we can only do it by listening to those who know what it's like on the ground, and that's parents, that's children, that's teachers, and that's other education staff, and we're in this for the long haul with them.
Thanks for that, Kula. One final question, very, very quickly, because we're running out of time. One came in from Michelle Templeton in Queens, and Michelle is asking about this notion of last resort that you've mentioned, and does having this in mean that there is still a continuation of that practice? And how do you answer that, I think?
Well, Michelle, aren't you in with the difficult questions this afternoon, Michelle? What has got you going? It's a really, really good question, and I don't think it is feasible to say to schools, particularly to some schools, that restraint and safe restraint has to be outlawed. What we have, because that's not the experiences of schools or of parents. Sometimes children are so distressed that for their own safety, they do have to be prevented from a certain element of movement. And there's no getting away. I've seen it in schools. I saw it when I volunteered in special schools as a young woman, and I've seen it when I visited schools as your children's commissioner. So I think we do have to be very careful about this use of the word last resort, and we do have to be clear that it's not a back door to ensuring the abuse of this practice. And so I think from what we're hearing from parents and what we're hearing from educationalists, that outlawing it and banning it is not feasible, but controlling it, regulating it, recording it, monitoring it is the way to make sure that it is last resort, and in the most extreme circumstances. And that is the only way. I see another question. That is the only way we're going to use to ensure compliance with all international instruments, including the UNCRPD.
Thanks very much for that, Kula. I'm going to stop there. Sorry again if people put questions that we weren't able to get to. Obviously, time is against us. I would like to thank the panel sincerely for their time today. Very much thanking Orla, Emma, Graham and Ricky from the department as well. It's been brilliant to get their input today. I'm going to now move on to Kula, who's going to make her closing remarks. So thanks again, everybody.
So thank you, Mairead, and again, thank you to the panel. I suppose it feels like I'm going to tell you a story sitting in this chair, but I'm not, and I'm going to be very quick. As we were talking about the report, it suddenly struck me, is it neither or is it neither? Neither seen nor heard, neither seen nor heard. I don't mind which way you say it, but as long as you say it. Because I'm very proud, and NICCY, our whole staff team, Mairead and the team are very proud of what we've produced today. As I've said, I don't underestimate the challenges of ensuring that every child in a class or school receives the educational experience that they have an absolute right to, when some of those children display distressed behaviours that impact on others. And the broader education system does have a responsibility to support those schools that have such children and all educational settings to ensure that they meet the rights of all the children in their care. And the broader education system, DE and others, have a responsibility to hold those schools to account. And as I've already said, it's only by ensuring we have effective partnerships between the education system, with schools, with parents and carers, with children, that we are going to achieve a rights-compliant education system. So just to the thank yous, I do want to thank the advisory group, I know I've already mentioned them, who guided this work and supported the rollout of the surveys, the focus groups and the interviews. We're really grateful to the Department of Education who gave us a lot of time and supported the work, but particularly in their support, financial and other ways, of the parent engagement piece. NICCY staff showed enormous dedication and commitment during the most challenging of times, including during the pandemic. And I am so thankful to be working with each and every one of you. The wide range of professionals and practitioners working with children in educational settings who engage with NICCY through correspondence and focus groups, we couldn't have done this without you. And they included principals, vice principals, educational psychologists, SENCOs, allied health professionals, trade unions, academics and voluntary and community sector organisations. St Mary's, Stranmillis and the Education Authority were very, very generous with their time and with the information. And again, we were able to include best practice guidance as a result of that. Must also thank all those organisations who facilitated and supported the parent engagement work. ICARS, MENCAP, Parent Action and Parenting NI. All the young people and the parents who shared their artwork, poems, and of course the young person and all the parents who shared their stories today. The review would not have been possible without those parents who have relentlessly fought to have this issue properly addressed. And although I am Children's Commissioner every day of the week, I do try to have some downtime. But what I've learned is that parents who've experienced this don't have any downtime from this issue and work on it day and night, as my social media timeline often shows. We are mindful, and I'm speaking to the parents, we are mindful of the trust that you have placed in NICCY with your information, with your stories, and we will mirror your resilience back to you and work incredibly hard not to let you down. NICCY commits, as we do with our other reviews, to monitoring the implementation of the 15 recommendations and looking forward to having very robust, forthright conversations with departmental officials and the Minister and of course the Committee of Education. And we will engage with all relevant agencies to ensure that we achieve approved outcomes for children and young people. And just a reminder that neither seen nor heard is a report for every year, not just for Christmas. But with that in mind, I do want to wish you a happy Christmas. And I want to say to the parents who have had children who have been abused in this way, please let us take some of that burden from you. And really to you and your families, a really very happy Christmas. Thank you.
And just to thank everyone for attending today and for all your questions. And again, sorry we couldn't get through all of them. And very much as Kula said, we'll keep everyone informed of progress going forward. Thank you.